Hello, good afternoon. Today, our guest is Dr. Cameron Harwick, and we're going to be talking about money and modernity. So, Cameron, I have some interesting question to pose. Recently, you wrote a paper, Money and the Evolution of the Modern Mind. Cameron,
Mhm.
what is money?
Yeah, so I'm actually going to reframe that question because it's a very natural question, but I think it focuses us on the wrong place, as if you could identify some object called money and then say, well, a money economy is just an economy that has this thing called money, right? Instead, I want to go the other direction because what makes something money? It's not any quality of the good itself, but it's the way we use it. And I can't use something as money just by myself, right? Robinson Crusoe has nothing to do with money. He has no use for it. Money is only something I can use with other people. And so fundamentally, I want to say money is an expectation. Money is an expectation that there's some good that I can use. I can present to you, and I expect that you will react to this presentation in a certain way, maybe by giving me a good or service in exchange for that money. And so by focusing on money as an expectation, this is kind of the foundation to thinking of money as an institution, which is across several papers what I've been trying to do, right? Money is an institution that organizes the division of labor in a certain way. It solves certain problems. Uh, we specialize. I do one thing, you do another thing, and then we exchange, and we organize that based on money. Now, of course, money is not the only way to do that, but money is an extremely effective way of doing that. But fundamentally, money is a property of the society that uses it and not a property of the good itself.
Interesting point, Cameron. I like the point about the division of labor because I was planning to pose that question. What is the link between money and specialization?
Yeah. So, in thinking of money as a way of solving this problem, right? Money is, of course, not the only way to solve this problem. And the first thing, I know you have an economics background, and so the first thing for an economist is to realize that specialization is a problem because it's tempting for us to think of this as a natural thing, right? Adam Smith said we have a propensity to truck, barter, and exchange. Trade, of course, is positive sum, so we both benefit when we trade. And yet, most animals, most of the time, never trade. And so it's a puzzle. If trade is so beneficial, so obvious, so natural, why does this seem like such a difficult problem? And the reason for that is because even though if you and we specialize in exchange, that's good for both of us. It might be even better for me if I specialize and then you specialize, instead of trading, I'll go take your stuff, right? And then if you think that I'm going to take your stuff, then it's not worth it for you to specialize in the first place, right? And so no matter how great the benefits of exchange are, if we're worried about, us each other taking each other's stuff, specialization never gets off the ground. And so the basic problem of specialization, you need two things. You need enforcement and accounting. The enforcement is just make sure I don't take your stuff and you don't take my stuff, right? The accounting is about, well, how much do I get from other people? Because specialization implies exchange, right? And exchange can happen with any level of terms of trade. I can give you a little, you can give me a lot, or vice versa, right? Depending on what we specialize in. So, how do we account for what I've done for you and what you've done for me? And so, what I do across a couple papers here is I think of money as an exchange institution that solves both of these problems, uh, the enforcement and the accounting. And of course, part of the package of money uh, as an exchange institution is going to be territorial law. You don't really see a money economy taking off at anything more than the fringes of a society until you get the development of territorial law, which is somebody's ability to impose law on an entire territory rather than that being taken care of by competing groups themselves. But let me back up from there. I'll get to that later, because what I want to do here is contrast money against other ways of solving this problem. Because there is a connection between money and the division of labor. It's a very effective way of doing that, but it's not the only way. And it can't be the only way, because you can think of the division of labor as kind of biologically mandatory for humans. Right? You had Joe Henrich on your podcast previously,
Yes.
right? And his one of his earlier books, called The Secret of Our Success, he makes the point that there are, to a first approximation, 0 autarkic humans. And as big as our, wonderful, intelligent human brains are, if you dropped you or me in the middle of a forest, how long would we survive? Probably not that long, right? And so we really need each other to survive. Even people involved in food production, even your farmers, are not going to mostly consume things they produce. They're going to consume things other people produced. And so let's think about different ways of organizing this, right? In fact, this is how we come to enjoy our big, intelligent human brains, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to generate the calories to support this, because we're a lot more productive, of course, when we specialize and then trade. And so let's start with what I'll think of as the baseline way of answering this question, with some caveats. But you can think of this as the small forager band, which, again, with some caveats, you can think of as our environment of evolutionary adaptedness. There's some division of labor there, right? You don't see isolated humans, but you do see humans in small bands. Small bands are going to solve this problem basically entirely within their own heads. Robin Dunbar has talked about the human social brain and its capacity for keeping track of social relationships. What does this do? This solves the accounting problem, right? If I know you and you know me, and we have an ongoing relationship, and we're keeping track in that relationship of how much have you done for me? How much have I done for you? Who owes whom what? And in addition, the human social brain also has these built-in ways of solving the enforcement problem, right? We coordinate on certain norms and expectations so that if I try to cheat you out of something that I owe you, you can call on the rest of the band and say, hey, this guy's trying to cheat me out of something. And they'll say, go give him what you owe him. And I'll say, okay, fine. And we're all good. So humans are very well equipped for this. And again, we have these built-in ways of solving the accounting and enforcement problems. Now, of course, the problem with a small band is that it's small. So it's not going to support a whole lot of specialization or division of labor. There's a little bit in there, mostly on the basis of age, sex, but very little permanent division of labor. Let's suppose I'm in this band and I say, hunting and gathering is not for me. I want to go make pottery. And the rest of the band says, okay, we'll give it a shot. And so every day I make a pot and I trade that pot for somebody who gives me food. And everybody's happy for about a month, and then everybody has a pot, and then nobody wants another pot, and then I'm back to hunting and gathering, right? So I cannot, at that small scale, permanently specialize. It's just, whenever there's something to do, we assign tasks. In order to scale up and get something like permanent division of labor, which is a nice thing to have, I can be a lot more productive this way, we're going to need to scale up beyond personalistic societies, right? And at that scale, I'm not going to know everybody. So this is where we start to see in the human record, we start to see things like hierarchy. Hierarchy is a way for societies to scale up, because now all of a sudden I don't have to organize enforcement myself. Now there's somebody I can go to who can organize enforcement on my behalf, and that's a lot easier for me, right?
And Cameron,
Yeah.
these people will be more productive and intelligent. So are you saying that inequality is a source of progress? That's my opinion. It is.
Mhm. I think that's kind of an inescapable conclusion of a lot of the anthropological, archaeological evidence, as well as economic logic, right? Um, you need people who specialize as your society scales up. You need people who specialize in anything, including enforcement of norms, right? And so once you have people specializing in the enforcement of norms, well, now you have politics, right? Now you have people on top and people on bottom, people with power and people without power. And as a matter of fact, I Walter Scheidel had a piece where he argues that the only lasting way to reduce inequality is by reducing political complexity. And the only way you do that is if there's some huge social or natural disaster, right? Like the fall of Rome or some, natural disaster is gonna obliterate your society. It'll reduce inequality, but that's not a great trade-off, right? Is that about where you are? Is that about compatible with the way you think about things?
Yes, inequality is the source of progress. If we all had the IQ of somebody whose intelligence was below 70, would basically be retarded. Most people will never be Bill Gates, but we don't want the average person to be Bill Gates because that would limit product diversity. One person has to be Bill Gates, another person needs to be a comedian on YouTube, another person should be an actor. Without specialization, we cannot have diversity. And that's why, even though I take the argument of cognitive ability seriously, I appreciate cognitive diversity because if my IQ permits me to become an engineer, that's what I'm going to do. But if because of my IQ, I'm more adept at sports or giving jokes on YouTube, I can start a YouTube channel and make more money than an engineer.
I'm going to half agree with that because
Yeah,
what you
it
said,
depends. It all depends. Most YouTubers are not successful, but if I'm really good, I could make more than the engineer. But product diversity is important.
well, what you're saying is valid in a market economy.
Yes.
And in a market economy, and this is, I think where the conversation is going to get here eventually, but in a market economy, you do get this kind of stratification by ability, by comparative advantage, in a way that is actually pretty modern. And you don't see that necessarily as much in pre-monetary ways of organizing society. The people who are on top may or may not be smarter than the people who are on the bottom. Um, and so I would caution both people on the right who want to defend inequality and people on the left who want to, argue against inequality. Inequality can mean different things depending on how your society is organized. And inequality in a monetary economy means something very different from inequality in a pre-monetary society.
And people on the left, are you saying that they would prefer a pre-monetary society because they seem to have some delusions about inequality? The society that they prefer, the alternative to capitalism, isn't that equal.
Yeah, and so there's a question of when you say what do they really prefer? Um, I have no doubt that a lot of people on the radical left mean what they say. Now, of course, the question is that a consistent goal? And in the case of a lot of abolition of money, I would argue that's not a consistent goal. Like the abolition of money is not consistent with the reduction of inequality necessarily. It's not consistent with anything that anybody would regard as social justice. Now, money does encourage certain modes of thought that can manifest as disaffection, dissatisfaction. And so, and Simmel touches on some reasons why this might be the case. But it's important not to let that kind of dissatisfaction that comes with a money economy tempt us into going back to something. Because if we went back with our mindset that's used to a money economy and used to the way things work in a money economy, things would be much, much worse for us in a pre-modern economy, even though, you look at happiness data and foragers, in small bands, they report themselves as happier than people in modern economies. Now, that's true. A lot of people on the left will say, oh, the money economy was a mistake. I don't think that follows, right?
But Cameron, there are some studies showing that well-being correlates with economic freedom, and rich people in rich countries are quite happy. There was one academic who did a number of these studies. Apparently, he was an older person, so he's no longer around. He passed some years ago, so I couldn't get to interview him. But he was one of the experts in this arena. Ed, his name was Ed.
Yeah. So you're talking about the observation that happiness is positively correlated with economic freedom. I would actually be skeptical of that. I don't think that's wrong, but I don't think it's necessarily a meaningful result either, just because I'm skeptical on the one hand of cross-country happiness data, just because people understand the question differently, which is kind of what I was getting at with the hunter-gatherers, right? They're going to understand that question very differently from you or me. And so I don't know if it makes sense to compare happiness across countries. But also, the Economic Freedom Index, I'm also skeptical of the meaningfulness of that. There have been people who have done factor analysis on the Economic Freedom of the World Index, and they come up with different principal components. I think that would be a little more meaningful than the regular Economic Freedom of the World Index, but as it stands, I would not put a whole lot of stock in a lot of that research, even though it can come up with some suggestive results. So I don't disbelieve that there's this correlation, but I also don't necessarily believe that this paper would be good evidence of it.
Mm, That's interesting. It's interesting because I see you as a free market economist, and funnily, many of these studies are being produced by people outside of the West. A lot of Africans have been studying economic freedom, and they're finding similar results.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's some part of my hesitation too is that uh, there's a lot of things going on underneath economic freedom. And you're going to come up with a lot of paradoxes if you think of economic freedom as a thing that you want to maximize. So, for example, one of the components of the Economic Freedom Index is size of government. Now, size of government actually, if I remember correctly, it has basically no correlation with any of the other pieces of the index, right? In fact, if you look at size of government, including national, federal, and local, if you add up all the different layers, there's even a negative correlation. Now, for a lot of so-called free market economists, this is going to be, this is a little puzzling.
Not
How
quite.
could it be? Well, I mean, you may have an explanation, but you know, if we think about what goes into economic freedom, and this is part of what I'm trying to do in the Simmel hypothesis papers, think of this not as a policy question, because policy can go any which way, right? And you get these weird paradoxes with size of government. But if we think of economic freedom as a set of norms, and specifically, and again, going back to your interview with Joe Henrich, if we think of these as a manifestation of weird norms, I think we'll get a lot farther and have a lot more actionable results than if we treat this as primarily a policy question, which is going to result in tons and tons of just development failures, which is what we've seen over the history of development economics.
Yes, so my retort is that efficiency would be a better proxy for government size. So for example, Singapore has relatively high levels of economic freedom. The government is typically bigger than normal, but it is an efficient government. So Lee Kuan Yew was serious about facilitating the private sector. So in the
Mhm.
typical country, bureaucrats are competing with the private sector. In Singapore, the job of a bureaucrat is to facilitate entrepreneurs. The entrepreneur is the customer who is always right. And that mindset is not embedded into the DNA of the average government institution. So when you
Yeah.
examine government efficiency as a proxy for government size, I think that makes better sense because what matters is the ability of the government to respond to market incentives and to think like a market entrepreneur and not a political entrepreneur.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that you're right that it's not size of government as such, but even beneath the question of efficiency of government, there's the cultural question of, is efficiency a widely accepted goal? In Singapore, it is. And so if you have a culture where efficiency is a terminal goal, it doesn't matter how big your government is because your government's going to run well, like in Singapore, right? Whereas, and part of the reason for this paradox with size of government is that if efficiency is not your goal, culturally speaking, you're going to have very, very small governments. For example, a lot of places in sub-Saharan Africa, a lot of pre-modern governments,
Yes.
the relative size of government compared to what it is today is very, very small. But these were not free societies, right? Just because beneath both of these things is this question of the cultural value of efficiency, among other things.
Yeah, I'm happy that you brought up Africa because again, some studies show that government size is important, but Africa has a history of statelessness. And
Mm-hmm.
relative to other continents, Africa has not been as successful. So, and many studies pointing out that economic freedom is beneficial for Africa also argue that institutions are degrading economic growth because there is a paradox where economic freedom works, but the institutions are not aligned with the goal of achieving
Mm-hmm.
economic freedom. So that's the stumbling block.
Yeah. And so part of my goal overarching in these series of papers is to think of institutions not as policy questions. Because like you said, if you go in and you implement, good constitutions in, Liberia, as far as I'm aware, basically borrowed the US Constitution. It has on paper great institutions, but on the ground, people are not used to thinking uh, you know, in terms of impartial justice, in terms of bureaucratic norms rather than clientelist norms, in terms of efficiency rather than other goals as a terminal goal. And so, no matter what the institutions on paper are, it's not a question of the institutions on paper. It's a question of the underlying norms of the people in that culture.
Exactly. It's like that paper that Tabellini did some years ago on limited morality versus generalized morality. So
Mm-hmm.
in Western Europe, morality is generalized. Therefore, if I call the bank or a government agency to do business, it is irrelevant if we are friends or not. Whereas in
Mm-hmm.
some country, limited morality is super important. So you're speaking on the phone to somebody and you say, well, I know Elizabeth. And they say, oh, I know Elizabeth too. And because of that link, they get the job done. Whereas in the
Right.
West, people tend to be more impersonal and that promotes efficiency. So I'm from Jamaica, and
Mm-hmm.
Jamaica is a collectivistic country according to the Hofstede Index. And in Jamaica, if you're doing business with somebody and they discover that both of you have a common interest or know the same person, the business is expedited. But
Mhm.
if you don't know anybody, the process becomes protracted, and that's a waste of time and money.
Yeah, and I think this idea of generalized morality is a great way of thinking about this difference. And you're going back to the original question. You could think of um, generalized morality as being appropriate to a money economy and to the coordination within a money economy, whereas as an alternative to a money economy, you have things like finding common interests, knowing somebody and coordinating the division of labor that way. And maybe there's, the simulacrum of a money economy there too, like money maybe changes hands, but fundamentally the division of labor in your Jamaica example is being organized through personal connections, not through money. And that's just a completely different, and you point to the moral shift. It's not just an organizational shift, but it's a moral shift that has these organizational implications. So I think that's a great point. Yeah.
Yes, so I've written on the topic. I plan to write a paper on it soon, a longer paper, maybe for a journal. And it's a really simple issue that is not being investigated by many today. So a simple question: why capitalism does not flow to poorer countries? And the
Mm,
answer is obvious. It's due to disparities in individualism.
mm,
Individualistic countries are more likely to have pro-market institutions. Pro-market institutions are more successful in individualistic countries, according to new research. And individualism is a robust predictor of many social outcomes, even charity and financial literacy. Some poor countries in the developing world find it difficult to embrace capitalism because they are not individualistic. So in America, it's easy to pass a law saying that if a university gets 100 million from the government, the university can commercialize its output and the products will be owned by the university to promote individual wealth. In a collectivistic country, it's harder to sell that message.
mhm. Yeah, I broadly agree with that. Although the terms collectivism, individualism, those are used in a variety of different ways. So one wrench that might get thrown into the story you're telling is that for a lot of people, the typical example of a collectivist society is going to be China.
Yes.
Now, China has had a lot of success in the past few decades
So
with
so
adopting capitalist
so
institutions.
is Japan and
Hmm.
Singapore. East Asian countries are not individualistic, they're more collectivistic,
Hmm.
but they have had success. Why are they so successful? Again, the answer is not that difficult. They are higher in long-term orientation, and it's difficult to promote capital formation without time preference. If you can't think about the next 20 or 30 years, you can't save, invest, and innovate. So long-term orientation in East Asia compensates for the deficits of individualism.
Okay, so you're seeing this
Yeah,
as okay,
yeah,
interesting,
yes.
interesting.
So individualism and long-term orientation, they predict similar outcomes like the rate of entrepreneurship.
But you can
So East
substitute
Asia,
between them.
yes,
But you're saying you can substitute individualism for long-term
yes, yes.
orientation.
So because East Asians think in broader horizons, they planned it effectively. And with long-term thinking, you might even change some of your original propositions.
Hmm.
So it's what James Robinson would call a fluid culture versus a hardwired culture. He and his co-author, they have a series of papers, and these papers discuss cultural dynamics. So China is defined as having a fluid culture because it's easy to reconfigure negative cultural norms that impeded growth in one era, but can be appropriated to catapult growth in a new era. So Confucianism is seen as a doctrine that slowed growth in pre-modern China, but it propelled growth in modern China because Confucianism places a premium on human capital accumulation and long-term thinking. So,
Mhm.
so culture can be reconfigured to serve alternative ends.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to resolve that paradox. My suspicion, I don't necessarily think you're wrong here, although I would say that my suspicion is that too much has been made of the difference between East Asian and Western cultures, because what they have in common is a long history uh, of political institutions. And so I think that uh, that history of or that experience with political institutions is going to give them more in common than they have with places that, as you said, have a long history of statelessness.
Yeah, political complexity.
Mhm.
But a long history of statehood can also be negative. They say that in at the intermediate level is better because Asian states can become corrupt.
For sure. And you know, you might think of the state as a high variance strategy, right? Because if you don't have a state, well, you subsist on a certain level and, life is hard, but life, you might be happy with your life. Once you have a state, you're locked into a certain path, and that path might be a lot better than the stateless society, or it might be a lot worse. And so on the one hand, we have, Western Europe today. On the other hand, we have the Soviet Union. And there's also an argument. I mentioned Walter Scheidel. He actually made the argument that the Roman state became so anti-growth near its end that it was the collapse of the Roman Empire that took that set the stage for modern economic growth. That would have never happened without the collapse of Rome. You need to just scrap it and start over. Now, I don't know if I necessarily buy that, but it's an interesting argument, and I understand the logic of it.
It's all about the ability to learn. So after the Roman Empire collapsed, some people, for whatever reason, don't like to admit it, but the barbarians were able to learn. Many of them
Mhm.
were tutored by the church and secular authorities. So people can learn. And that's how Europe improved because the leaders were willing to learn and listen to the Christian scholars who were more experienced.
Mhm. Yeah, and it's interesting when you see kind of the same process in when the Mongols invaded China, right? The Mongols also adopted a lot of Chinese learning, a lot of Chinese fashion, and there was a lot more continuity in Chinese culture than there was in Chinese political systems. And same thing as you mentioned with the barbarians in Rome. Um, Initially, at least, the barbarians were not able to maintain the complexity of Roman civilization, and there was that dark age where literacy was lost, law was lost. But you're right that that was largely built up by these successor states and far surpassed Rome. It took them a while, but they did end up far surpassing Rome eventually.
But there's a this parallel between the barbarians and the Mongols. The Mongols would assimilate into the culture of some of the people they conquered, but they were not institution builders. They weren't intellectuals. So
Well, neither
they
were the
could
barbarians at the
yeah,
time.
they could appropriate the culture, but the Mongols didn't excel at
Mhm.
efficiently at the barbarians. So look at Mongolia today. Like I wouldn't live in Mongolia. It's just okay. Yeah, no, nobody really talks about Mongolia.
Well, barbarians, right, right. It certainly wouldn't have been obvious at the time of the barbarian invasions that
No,
the barbarians would successfully learn, right? It took them, another 500 years to even start doing that.
but it's just interesting that today Mongolia is just another country. So when you're reading economic reports, people don't really refer to Mongolia. They will talk about Indonesia, Malaysia, and other rising countries in Asia, even Kenya. But Mongolia, once one of the larger empires in the world, has basically been forgotten.
Well, I would also say that the country of Mongolia is not necessarily, we shouldn't think of that as continuous with the Mongol Empire, right? Similarly, we don't want to think about the country of Turkey as continuous with the Turkic expansion. Um, Turks are everywhere outside of Turkey. And so even though Turkey is a small, small country, relatively speaking, the legacy of the Turkic expansion is huge. And I would say the same thing for the Mongol expansion. That legacy is all over the place, even though the country of Mongolia is relatively marginal.
Yeah. And what both Mongolia and Turkey teach us is that empires don't lead to economic growth. So even today, despite the research of Patrick O'Brien, who has done great work to dispel that notion, people still think that colonialism promoted growth in the West.
So empires are an interesting question, thinking about our, going back to ways of coordinating the division of labor, because empires are fundamentally a pre-monetary way of organizing things. It's just, the same sort of Noah guy that you were talking about in Jamaica. If we scale that up, that's when you get empires, right? So empires are not what we're tempted to think about sometimes as, one country dominating another country. In fact, there's an interesting series of papers collected in a book that talked about ancient Mesopotamia and the old Babylonian Empire. And the old Babylonian Empire was, the most powerful empire, such as it was in the world at the time. But the argument of the paper was that these empires, right, the king of Babylon, Hammurabi or whoever it was, actually had no on-the-ground power outside of the city he lived in. All of his power over his entire empire was administered through patron-client relationships, knowing a guy, right? And that's what empires basically were throughout most of history. That's how the Roman Empire was, right? We imagine like Rome coming in and conquering a place and imposing Roman law, but that's not what happened. What Rome would do is Rome would overpower the one guy in charge. Everybody else, get left alone. They don't care about them. But if you overpower the one guy in charge, integrate him into your client network, then all of a sudden, we can, now you're part of our empire. How much control does that give Rome on the ground? Not a whole lot. And most empires work basically the same way. And so fundamentally, the kind of bureaucratic governance that we are used to in the West now with territorial law, that's a completely
Okay,
different
so
thing
so
from empire.
Cameron, I'm going to end this and we're going to do a part two. I'm going to send another link because it's going to close soon.
Gotcha. Sounds good. I'll see
Yeah.
you shortly.